Hello Year 12 Global Politics. Today we will be looking at the International Monetary Fund and we'll be focusing on their aims, their role and the power. In terms of the key skills associated with this part of the course, you need to be able to explain the aims and the roles of the IMF, be able to evaluate the power of the IMF, assess the extent to which the IMF can achieve their aims, and analyse how they can challenge a state's sovereignty. So those are the key skills and what you should be really focusing your revision and your notes on. So in terms of the main aims of the IMF, there are four. The first is to promote international monetary cooperation. So what that really looks like is the IMF being able to cooperate with states, and every year the IMF will hold bilateral discussions with states. There are 190 states involved in the IMF, and these bilateral discussions are what states agree to when they do sign up with the IMF. In terms of what that further looks like, the IMF will then use the information that they get from these discussions and create a database on the state, and so they can understand how the world economy looks and be able to share that with other countries. So that's part of their surveillance and further on helps with their capacity development. So yeah, to provide or to promote international monetary cooperation. Another aim of the IMF is to make resources of the fund temporarily available. So for states that are experiencing the balance of payment issues, they will be able to receive resources, primarily that will look like a loan. And they will also promote the expansion and growth of trade and also promote exchange stability. So those are the four main aims. You need to be able to explain those aims. In terms of the roles of the IMF, there are a few again. You need to be able to explain all of them and have examples that will support them. So in terms of providing loans, that's probably the easiest one to discuss because they do provide loans to many countries and are doing so and have done so for a very long time. So to provide loans to states that have run out of money, and that's really simply put, it's really for states that have experienced balance of payment issues. We know from when we've talked in class that Argentina did have a loan and have had a loan from the IMF. That is the $57 billion loan. And from Pakistan also have a loan of $6 billion. At the moment, because of COVID, currently the IMF is loaning $285 billion to states, and they do have the capacity to loan up to $1 trillion in states that need to. So in terms of providing loans, that's probably one of their main roles, and they really do this to countries that are experiencing those balance of payment issues. Their second role is to monitor economic policies through country surveillance. So they will collect data about the country's economy. They will have annual meetings with the officials as well as giving them advice on how the state should run. This is part of Article 4 of the IMF, and it says that really states will agree, if they are part of the IMF, to have these annual discussions. And finally, to offer capacity development. So states to help low and middle income countries grow their economies faster and to avoid problems. They will maybe provide suggestions like how to improve their central bank, gather statistics, make the tax system run effectively, and so on. So, they may provide advice to the state. In terms of the power of the IMF, most of their power comes from their financial capacity, and that is in the IMF, they have $17 trillion, and that's made up by the quotas that states will contribute to the IMF. That $17 trillion allows the IMF to lend to different countries. So that's really where they get their power, because when they then use this money available to help a state, that gives the IMF power to influence their economy and allows the IMF to carry out their roles. to lend money, to surveil countries, to give capacity development. That their financial capacity of $17 trillion enables them to do their roles, and that will also enable them to influence their country's economy. The IMF also can impose conditions on countries that do take on their loans, and that is where they can also influence a country. So, for example, with Argentina, with their $57 billion loan, they advised Argentina to cut costs through taxing exports, increasing the wealth tax, scaling back inefficient energy subsidies. All their suggestions there were because they gave Argentina money, and the conditions imposed were, influencing the decision making, making them do things that they may not have previously done. So the money that the IMF gives to countries enables them to, help countries and then influence their economies. However, the IMF can lack power, and this is because the IMF mainly is criticised for being an instrument of US power. The US has the largest voting rights in the IMF. They make up probably 20%, so they do then have a large say in how the IMF will operate. Even the way that the IMF do operate, they do have a neoliberal when they have a neoliberal understanding of how economies should work, and that is really based on Western influence. So, that does mean that states like the US are influencing what they do. Also, having China have created their own version of the IMF. So that really is, in direct competition with the IMF. That bank is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Currently I don't think that statistic is correct, I feel like it's more than that, but there are a number of countries that are part of this. So, that can offer, that is a direct competition to what the IMF is currently doing. And, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank does avoid the kinds of conditions imposed by the IMF. So it does allow some developing nations to maybe go to them instead of the IMF. So this is where the IMF may not be able to actually influence countries. In terms of challenging a state's sovereignty, the IMF does have this power through giving out its loans. So with the loans, there are conditions imposed on it, and these conditions then can make countries, or can influence countries to alter their economies and do different things. So, for example, in 2018, the IMF lent $57 billion to Argentina with conditions imposed, such as taxing exports and increasing the wealth tax. In terms of how that actually challenged Argentina's sovereignty, well, it meant then that Argentina had limited flexibility to create their own economic and social policies. They had to follow what the IMF had told them and had to follow the conditions that were given to them. So that does challenge the ability of Argentina to make their own rules and make their own decisions in this area. Also, the IMF has lent to states who can't pay back their debt. This has again been seen in Argentina and also in Ghana, where they have imposed conditions that are quite harsh. However, in saying this, the IMF is the bank of the last resort, and states are the ones that are asking the IMF for money. So this means that states must have some faith in the IMF. They must in some way think that the IMF is good. And so by asking the IMF for help, they are allowing their own sovereignty to be challenged. So we have to remember that it's, yes, the conditions are harsh, but states are still asking the IMF for money, so they must still want it. Okay, so in terms of a practice question, this was in 2016. It was just to state one aim of the IMF and to explain the power of the IMF. In terms of how to answer it, the aims of the IMF are on their website. So if you are ever unsure, you can always go back to that. But the main ones that we have spoken about today are there. So the first is promoting exchange rate stability, promoting international monetary cooperation, assisting in multilateral system of payments, providing resources to members experiencing the balance of payment difficulties, promoting high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reducing poverty around the world. So what you need to do here is just state one aim. Just give one aim. The second question was worth 4 marks and is about the power. So what students needed to do here was explain how the IMF have power. We did obviously talk about that today, but to go through the sample answer, or to go through what the examiner report says, it's that the power of the IMF resides in its economic policy. So what we've spoken about, the IMF has power because states are given a loan and there are conditions attached to that loan. There we go. So what they say here, though, is higher scoring responses include a full explanation of conditional loans with specific examples, an emphasis on conditionality, so limits on public spending, pressure for the privatisation of state-owned assets, the expedited implementation of trade liberalisation measures, and so on. So what you need to do here is include an example as well. So what we could have done with this answer is explain how the IMF in a country perhaps like Argentina, they have imposed conditions on their $57 billion loan, and so Argentina now must follow what conditions have been imposed on them, such as tax exports, wealth tax, and so on. So yeah, that is how you will go about answering that question. I hope today's video was helpful for the IMF, and I will see you in my next video.